The story we're about to hear tonight gives real credence to that saying, history, you just can't make that stuff up. I mean, this is an amazing story that we're so thrilled to have Dr. Natalie Robertson with us to share it with us. Natalie has spent 30 years investigating the Clotilda crime, and it really is a crime, a shocking story. And she is one smart cookie, and I have to acknowledge her mom, Bessie, who's with us this evening, for raising a daughter that has her first magna cum laude graduate of the University of Detroit Mercy. She received her BA in history there, her first master's in museum studies from Hampton University, her second master's and her doctorate in American studies are from the University of Iowa. So Bessie, you done good. You really did with Natalie and her scholarship. Natalie is an award-winning scholar. She has taught at some of the top institutions in the country and the world, including the Smithsonian and the Advanced Studies in England program at Oxford in England. She's a recipient of the National Endowment for the Humanities Faculty Research Award that facilitated her field research in West Africa and in slave ports of Benin and Nigeria. And Bessie tells me she was a wreck because when Natalie was over there doing this research 30 years ago, we didn't have the cell phone service and the kind of ways Zooming and FaceTiming and staying in touch with family. So we acknowledge the cell industry for allowing us to stay in touch. Natalie's provocative book, The Slave Ship Clotilda and the Making of AfricaTown, USA, was nominated for a Library of Virginia Literary Award, and it's for sale in our gift shop, member discount, and we'll have a book signing following the lecture. Natalie is currently an adjunct professor at Hampton University. She's back where you were in school a long time ago. She is featured in the newly released National Geographic film, Clotilda, the Last American Slave Ship, which you can watch on Hulu and what's that other thing? Disney Plus, thank you. Couldn't think. But it's now time to hear from the woman who can tell us an amazing story, and we look forward to it. And join me in welcoming Dr. Natalie Robertson.
Thank you so much, Julie, for that wonderful introduction. Good evening, everyone. Good evening to those of you who are here, as well as those of you who are joining us remotely from around the world. I have to say that for the first time, I'm a bit nervous giving this lecture because one of my staunchest critics is here in the form of my mother, Bessie Robertson, my beautiful mother. Let's applaud her one more time for her support. Let's applaud all of the mothers who have given us life and who have supported us throughout our whole lives. Thank you, Mother, for 61 years of life, half of which have been spent on this case, but none of which would have been possible without you. So thank you, Mom. This research spans 30 years, 3 continents, and 3 West African countries, made possible by many people and institutions. The list is quite long, but it is necessary to acknowledge their contributions to this important work, including Hampton University. Let's also applaud Dr. William R. Harvey for 43 years of stellar leadership at Hampton University. He was my president as a graduate student for 2 years and my boss for 19 years at Hampton. So thank you very much, Dr. Harvey, and congratulations on your much-deserved retirement. The Hampton University Museum, the University of Iowa, the University of Ibadan, the University of Jos, the Université du Benin, Howard University, Spelman College and UNCF Mellon, Spring Hill College and the University of South Alabama, the Advanced Studies in England program affiliated with University College Oxford, Gorée Institute, Senegal, National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Archives, Fort Monroe National Monument, the National Park Service, the National Trust for Historic Preservation through its African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, James Madison's Montpelier, Gulf Quest, National Maritime Museum of the Gulf of Mexico, National Geographic, Search Inc. and Search H2O, the Explorers Club, the Alabama Humanities Foundation, the AfricaTown Preservation Heritage Foundation, the History Museum of Mobile, the Zumboji Village Museum, chess.org, move.org, and the AfricaTown International Design Idea Competition, Fox 10 Mobile, Southern Rose Productions, Project 10, Justice for the 110, My Interpreters in Africa, Olayinka Adekola, and Martine de Souza, the Clotilda Descendants Association, and all of the descendants and individuals who have assisted me in Mobile, the United States, and abroad over 30 years. And last, but certainly not least, I wish to thank the Mariners Museum for inviting me to lecture on the Clotilda during its Captive Passage exhibition in 2002, 20 years ago, and for inviting me back to deliver this 30th anniversary lecture. The Mariners Museum is such a fitting venue for this occasion that has brought me back full circle on this topic. So thank you very much, President Hagee, and thank you, Julie Murphy, for inviting me back. An enduring question surrounding the Clotilda case is how this case emerged so late in the slave trade. The Clotilda was no ordinary slaving venture. It was a smuggling crime hatched and launched by Timothy Maya, a wealthy plantation magnate in Mobile, and William Foster, the Clotilda's captain, in defiance of Federal Piracy Act of 1820 that codified the importation of Africans as illegal, piratical, and punishable by death. Southerners viewed the Piracy Act as an encroachment upon states' rights to regulate importations. Moreover, Southerners smuggled with impunity, understanding that although several smugglers were caught, they were not prosecuted due largely to quid pro quo relationships between smugglers and law enforcement agents charged with enforcing anti-smuggling laws at sea and on land. Within this context, Maya and Foster hatched the Clotilda smuggling scheme to prove that they could successfully import a cargo of Africans into the United States without being prosecuted, convicted, and hanged under the Piracy Act. My 30-year investigation of this crime began in 1992. As a doctoral student at the University of Iowa, where my dissertation chair, Dr. Alan F. Roberts, encouraged me to pursue AfricaTown as a topic for my dissertation. He provided funding through PASALA, the Project for the Advanced Study of Art and Life in Africa, strengthened by funding from the Stanley UI Foundation, for my travel to AfricaTown to conduct a feasibility study, and later to the Republic of Benin to begin this research. So off I went to the slave port of Ouidah in the Republic of Benin. I am standing in the Zumboji Village Museum with shackles around my neck, a powerful acknowledgement of the more than 2 million captives that were warehoused at Zumboji before being sold to European and American buyers. My research shows that the Clotilda Africans were warehoused at Zumboji prior to being sold to Captain Foster. So I am here to gain insight into what I refer to as slave trade protocol, as that protocol was devised and implemented by the Fon warriors who controlled slave trading in Ouidah. I gained that insight through interviews with descendants of Fon slave traders who controlled slave sales at Zumboji, including Supreme Chief Kakanaku, who was in charge of all of the operations at Zumboji, Chief Gungpe, who was the second in charge at Zumboji, whose responsibility it was to care for Africans who were warehoused there. And if you travel to Zumboji, you will see a lot of memorials, if you will, that commemorate the Fon warriors' involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, including stone statues that depict the manner in which Africans were held, bound, and gagged, if you will, prior to being sold to European and later American buyers like Captain Foster. A second enduring question surrounding the Clotilda case is where the captives hailed from. In the history of the slave trade, point of sale is rarely point of capture. Although Ouidah was the point of sale and export, if you will, for the Clotilda Africans, and if you look at the map here, this is where Ouidah sits in the Republic of Benin, and the Bight of Benin, if you will. Although they were sold in the Republic of Benin, in the slave port of Ouidah, they were actually captured in neighboring Nigeria, in the Empire of Oyo, and further into the central region of Nigeria in Kaduna State. My research shows that the Clotilda Africans were sold at Ouidah, but most of them were captured in neighboring Nigeria, corroborated in part by Cujo's map. My research shows further that the Clotilda Cargo contained a large pocket of Yoruba-speaking captives like Cujo, his wife Albine, Kupoloo, and others who were captured in a raid on a farm in Owini, a royal farm controlled by the Oyo Empire. So with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities Faculty Research Award, I arrived at the Oyo Palace in southwestern Nigeria, where I am greeted, as is custom, by the royal drummers playing talking drums. And I wondered what they could be saying. First and foremost, they would say to me, Ekabo. Can you say that? Everyone say that, please. Ekabo. Ekabo is Yoruba for welcome. So they are welcoming me to the palace. I wondered what else they could be communicating about me via these talking drums. I'm quite certain they are saying, and she's a female. And they are probably saying, and she's a Black American female, which at that particular time was a bit rare to see a Black American female in the interior of Nigeria for the purposes of conducting research. It's not so rare these days, but at that time, I think it was a bit rare. And they may also be saying, and we think she has some money, so you should let her into the palace. And what I'm referencing is the fact that information is a commodity, and that's true all over the world, and it's no less true in Africa. So, many Africans make money from tourism, and I was quite happy to pay for information as long as it was good information and it was verifiable, and I could cross-check it against other data to make sure that it was the kind of data that I needed for my particular research. So I arrived at the Palace of Oyo in 2003 to talk to the Ilari. On the left is Obalolua, in the middle, Ikudefun, and on the right side, Obakayeja. The Ilari are the palace historians, and I arrived there to gain insight into why Oyo was a target for Fon warriors who engaged in a protracted war with their Yoruba neighbors, whom they viewed as their enemies. As Fon warriors launched raids on Yoruba villages, they sold their Yoruba enemies into the slave trade. And for this reason, most slave cargoes that exported from Ouida in the middle of the 19th century contained Yoruba captives. Now I'm glossing over the evidence a bit due to its complexity, but you can learn more about the specifics of the raid on Cudjo's farmstead, for example, in chapter 5 of my book. So you have a reading assignment now to do. I am in Oyo in general, but I am also in a community called Owini. And this is a community in which Cudjo mentioned in his various interviews with individuals that his farmstead was located in, and it is the farmstead from which he and others were captured. And here is a farmer demonstrating yam cultivation in Owini. And this is very important to the story of origins because Cudjo transferred this knowledge to Alabama, where he explained with precision the process for cultivating yams. Now, although yams are cultivated by several African groups, the Yoruba are the premier yam cultivators of West Africa. So this was another indication that Cudjo, for example, was a Yoruba man. Like most slave cargoes, the Clotilda Cargo was culturally and linguistically diverse. Although the Clotilda captives collectively were exported from Ouida, again, place of sale or place of export is rarely place of capture. They were exported out of Ouida but they were captured, most of them, in neighboring Nigeria, in Oyo, and further into the Nigerian interior in Kaduna State, and at least one captive came from the Abuja area. This is an image of Hausa horsemen who, in the history of the slave trade, would have conducted slave raids by horseback. So there were several ways that you could acquire Africans. Sometimes you would, capture them in spontaneous raids. Some raids were more planned. In the case of the sack on Cujo's village, he was captured by Fon warriors, infantry, who marched to that region and launched the raid on his village. They marched to that region by foot, but also you have Hausa slave raiders who captured Africans by horseback, by basically running them down, typically farmers, catching them in the fields, in the open fields, and running them down, netting them, restraining them, and then selling them to typically middlemen who would then carry them from that region down to the coast, where they would be sold again. So for those Africans, for example, who said, I was sold twice, what that typically means is that they were captured far in the interior, perhaps taken down halfway, sold to a middleman in the trade, who then took them down to the coast and who sold them again to buyers there. So in the Clotilda Cargo, you have some Africans who were captured directly by Fon warriors, others who were captured once and then transported over a long distance and sold again. But ultimately, they end up in the same cargo. So my research shows that the Clotilda Cargo contained a second contingent of Africans who hailed from various communities, primarily in Kaduna State, which is in central Nigeria. And again, many of those Africans were captured by Hausa slave raiders. My research reveals further that the names that these Clotilda Africans bore are not personal names, but they are the names of the places from which they hailed in the Kaduna region. When I got to that region, I wanted to investigate the name of one Clotilda African called Conco, because that was the name that was giving me the most trouble on this side of the Atlantic. So I said to myself, when I got to that region, I was going to inquire about that name first. So when I got to that region, I went to the University of Jos and visited with Dr. Joseph Jimker, who was one of the premier archaeologists on the Kaduna region. So he agreed to see me, and when we had a conversation, the first thing I asked him about was the name Conco. When I pronounced that name to him, he told me immediately, no, it's not Conco, it's Kaniko. So I said, okay, could you explain this a bit further? And what he said to me is that during translations, when African names are translated or converted to English, sometimes letters and syllables are dropped. In other cases, things may get added. So, for example, if you look at the name Kaniko at the bottom of that sign on the right-hand side, you see the name Conco really embedded in that name. If you drop the I in the N in the middle, and then if you drop the N on the end of that word, what you end up with is Conco. So it all began to make sense because, after all, after so many years of conducting research on this side of the Atlantic, my research agenda led me to that region based upon the evidence that I had at the time. So I said, all right, well, that makes sense. Let's go further, because one piece of the evidence is always questionable, but all of the evidence in the aggregate doesn't lie. So from there, I did visit the village of Conco, and I had a conversation with Malam Tete, who at the time was the leader of that community. And we talked extensively about the slave trade and about the culture of the people in that area. And most of the people in that area, as is the case in many other areas in Africa, are cultivators. So we discussed that, and I talked about my research, and we began to talk about what it all meant for an African American, for example, to come to Africa, to have a conversation about, Africans who were captured in his region and then ultimately sold into the slave trade. So we did have that conversation. Meanwhile, I had an opportunity to meet with some of the farmers from the region, both male and female farmers, because farming is very important to African peoples all over the continent of Africa. You really won't find any African culture that doesn't engage in some level of agriculture. And we also know that many of those agricultural practices were ultimately transferred to AfricaTown, which was founded by 30 members of the Clotilda Cargo in Mobile, roughly 3 miles north of the Mobile Business District. And I'll talk about that momentarily. But from Conco, I went to the village of Jabba, because there was an African in the Clotilda Cargo named Jabba. And as I said before, many of the names that the Africans bore from the central region were not personal ones. They were actually the names of the places in which they were captured. So you have Conco from Conco, you have Jabba from the community of Jabba, and you see the name Jabba on this sign here. And so I went to that community and I spoke with some chiefs there, because what is very important about this research is that it really depends upon, and it is derived from about 50 interviews that I have conducted with individuals on both sides of the Atlantic. Because although I am a researcher, I'm also an outsider looking into a culture. And I don't proclaim to know all there is to know about that culture. And in fact, if you want to gain some insight into a culture, you should talk to the people who are members of that culture. And that is something that is not often done, or not done often enough. I mean, people write about Africa, and they talk about Africa, but quite often they don't talk to Africans to solicit their input and their perspectives and insights on the culture. I did not want my research to repeat that mistake. So although I am a researcher, I am very much in the position also of a student who is learning all over again from the people who live there. And one of the things that I ask the Jabba chiefs is why it is that a person named Jabba, when taken to North America, when taken to the United States, or when taken out of the Jabba community, why it is that person would not use their personal name. And his response was that wherever Jabba people go, they carry their community with them. So the fact that Jabba was using the name of the place from which he hailed is a testament to the fact that wherever Jabba went or was carried in the world, he was carrying his community with him. So this begins to corroborate my original theory that the Clotilda Africans coming from this region of Nigeria are really bearing the names of the places in which they were captured. They are not bearing personal names. Now, this is a woman who was in the Clotilda Cargo. They called her a Backy, but it's spelled a couple of different ways. But what her name really references is the fact that she was a bache, but it all gets sort of condensed and reduced to a Backy, and they called her a Backy in Alabama. But in actuality, her name is composed of two words, a and bache, signaling the fact that she was a bache woman or one who came from the bache community, which is in the Kaduna region. Now, collectively, all of the Africans in the Clotilda Cargo were referred to as Tarcars. That's how they were originally described in Alabama. They were all called collectively Tarcars. Well, I am in the village of, or the chiefdom of Takad, and one of the areas in Takad is called a Takar. So if you look at the bottom of that sign on the right-hand side, you can see that this name, Takar, follows the same structure and morphology as Takar. So by going to the central region, it really gave me a spatial perspective on that area, and it allowed me to understand that the Africans who were captured in that Kaduna region bore the names of the places in which they were captured, and they were captured within a 30-mile radius of one another. I did have an opportunity to speak with the Agwam of Takad. He is the chief or the supreme chief of Takad. There he is with his wife. And we spoke extensively about the slave trade, and we began to have conversations about how we felt about the slave trade and, you know, his feelings about so many Africans being enslaved from his particular region. And of course, he was remorseful over the slave trade, but he actually extended out an invitation to the Clotilda Africans and to African Americans in general, inviting them to come back to his region, to settle there. and to share in the land. This is Kazuma, also known as Aunt Zuma in AfricaTown. Aunt Zuma is sort of an outlier, if you will, in the sense that she wasn't captured exactly in the Kaduna region, but she was captured south of that in an area called Abuja. And her name indicates that she was captured in the area of Zuma Rock. And this is Zuma Rock. Zuma Rock is this massive megalith that I do believe is the result of very, very ancient volcanic activity in the area. In fact, when you go to central Nigeria, you know, if you're a nature lover like me, you're just going to be amazed at what you see in terms of the topography, right? Like most places, when you come into Nigeria, or let's just take Hampton Roads, for example, we're right at sea level. But as you move up to Richmond and DC, and in the case of Nigeria, if you come into Lagos and then you move to Ibadan, and from there into the Jos Plateau region, the elevation is going to increase. And you're also going to see some of the most fascinating rock formations you have ever seen in your life. And when I was in the Republic of Benin and I traveled into the interior of Benin, I actually saw people living atop of those rocks, I mean, high in the elevations. And they say they've been there basically since the days of slave raiding, because what those rocks allowed them to do was to use them as sort of, safe havens and refuges, places of refuge, where they could scale the rocks and hide from the slave raiders. And they've been living atop those rocks ever since. But there's a lot of diversity in Africa, and if you think that African Americans are resilient now, insofar as they've been able to survive slavery and Jim Crow and lynching and so on and so forth, then African Americans really hail from resilient communities. And you'll see that when you go to Africa. When you see people dwelling atop the rocks, I mean, they dwell there, which means they have to descend those rocks, when they want to acquire provisions sometimes, and they have to ascend them again. And then if you move into another region of Nigeria, if you go into, for example, Mali, which is north of Nigeria, and you visit with the Dogon peoples, for example, you will see that they don't live atop the rocks, they live inside the rocks in a sense. They have carved their houses into the sides of the hills. And it is really a fascinating thing to see, this level of diversity in terms of architecture and in terms of the way in which people make use of the natural resources that surround them. So, we have a pocket of Africans in the Clotilda Cargo who were captured in Oyo. We have a second pocket of Africans who were captured in the Kaduna region, but they all end up converging in Ouida, where they become, or they make up the Clotilda Cargo. And typically, when they are captured in the interior, they are brought down to the village of Zumboji and warehoused there prior to sale. Once the sale has been made, for example, once Captain Foster had paid for the Africans, they would then have been taken out of the village of Zumboji and marched down what is called now the route of slaves, leading out of the village of Zumboji to the beach. So they would have been taken out of Zumboji, taken down to the beach where they were barracooned temporarily before being placed into the hold of the Clotilda that is waiting offshore. And typically, that's the way in which slave cargoes were transported, if you will. They would have been stored or kept inland for a while until the transactions were completed. They would not have been stored at the beach for a very long time or barracooned on the beach for a very long time, because then you have the problem of pirates working to steal members of those cargoes. So by protocol, by tradition, and for security reasons, the Fawn warriors would have kept the Clotilda Africans at Zumboji. Then once Captain Foster purchased them, taken them or moved them out of the village of Zumboji down the route of slaves, barracooned them on the beach temporarily until such time as Africans could put them in boats and row them out to the Clotilda that is waiting offshore. And this is a cross-section of the Clotilda, which was a two-masted schooner ship. And you can see the Africans and the way in which they would have been stowed or stored in the hold of the ship. And originally, I surmised that they were not tightly packed in the hold, but recent research, particularly the work that Dr. James Delgado has been doing, the lead marine and maritime archaeologist who is now excavating the Clotilda as we speak in the eastern branch of the Mobile River, has explained to us that the hold of the Clotilda, where the Africans were stowed, measured no more than about 500 square feet. So that would consider them to be tightly packed, particularly when they numbered 110 of them. Captain Foster actually purchased 125 Africans. But because the Clotilda was under the watchful eyes of the authorities that were patrolling the seas looking for smugglers, he weighed anchor in haste, leaving 15 Africans in the water, which means that the Clotilda Cargo numbered 110 captives. And the Clotilda transported them across the Atlantic to Mobile, Alabama, where those Africans were disembarked July 9th, 1860. And we don't have a lot of information about the Middle Passage experiences of the Clotilda Africans, but we do know that Middle Passage voyage lasted roughly 7 weeks, which is a much shorter time than it took traditionally to cross the Atlantic, because traditionally it might take about 3 months. But the Clotilda is a schooner ship that is built for speed. In fact, it's a technology that emerges right at the time in which federal authorities are trying to chase down smugglers at sea. So to evade capture, you get a lot of schooner and clipper ships, fast-sailing vessels being built, which then allowed smugglers to evade capture at sea. So the Clotilda is at sea or makes the Middle Passage voyage in roughly 7 weeks. But that doesn't mean that the experiences of her captives were no less horrific. Being confined to the Clotilda's Hold for that period of time, and under those conditions, the Clotilda Africans suffered dehydration. As Cujo recounted, "We so thirst. They give us little bit of water, 12 hours, which is a reference to the traditional half pint of water given to captives every 12 hours. And that dehydration was exacerbated by the food poisoning that developed from the consumption of rancid food. And given the identities and the nature of most crewmen and captains aboard slave ships, I would not rule out that the captives were also sexually assaulted aboard the Clotilda, although we don't have any concrete evidence of it. I would not rule that out because they were naked and exposed, as Cujo recounted. Oh, Lord, I so shame. We come into America's soil naked, and the people say, we naked savage. They say, we don't wear no clothes. So, being naked and exposed aboard a slave ship for weeks, and in other cases, months at a time, exposed them to many diseases and exposed them to sexual assaults, so that the hold of a slave ship, and a slave ship in general, was a veritable death trap, if you will, for many Africans. And, you know, typically a third of all cargoes did not survive that Middle Passage voyage for that reason or those reasons and for others. But as far as we can tell, all 110 of the Clotilda Africans survived the Clotilda's Middle Passage voyage. So that a third enduring question surrounding the Clotilda case is how the captives overcame their victimization. After a horrifying 7-week Middle Passage voyage, the Clotilda Africans arrive in the America soil, as Cujo called it, on July 9, 1860, in Alabama, where they were distributed to various plantations and places. Timothy Mayer took 30 captives to his plantation in Mobile, where he left them to fend for themselves. With no means to repatriate their West African homelands, those captives resolved to build their own Africa in America, memorialized by AfricaTown. AfricaTown is a proclaimed sister community to Ouida, a National Register Historic District, a UNESCO slave port, and most recently, a World Monument Fund site. Located 3 miles north of Mobile, the Mobile Business District, AfricaTown is a symbol of resiliency because rather than succumb to their victimization, the Clotilda Africans built their own AfricaTown as Cudjoe called it, in which they built their own houses, their own churches. This is Union Baptist Church in AfricaTown that was built by the Clotilda Africans. The Clotilda Africans also built their own houses in AfricaTown. This is Cudjoe sitting in his house that he built in AfricaTown. This is the remnant of a chimney that was attached to the house of Jabba, one of the Clotilda Africans. The Clotilda Africans also raised their own food because, of course, many of them hailed from farming communities, so they transferred that farming knowledge and those farming techniques and skill sets to AfricaTown and applied them to their New World situation. Now, this is Mrs. Vernie Stone, the late, great Vernie Stone, the woman who helped me during my initial travels to AfricaTown. She, as far as I know, is not or was not a descendant, but she was so excited about the history of AfricaTown. She really took it upon herself to introduce me to a lot of people, and I owe a great debt to what she did for me very early on because, again, I was a stranger in a community looking in. And in order for me to sort of gain the confidence of people so that, you know, they would talk to me and share information with me and share their family histories with me, she was the one who took it upon herself to introduce me. And at the time, I took this picture. You know, she was standing in the middle of a collard green field in AfricaTown, and I have never seen collard greens as big as those ever in my life. But as she and others have said, we never go hungry in AfricaTown. And it's because people are basically self-reliant and they practice communal living. And so the Clotilda Africans built their own church, they built their own houses, they raised their own food, they served as caretakers of their own cemetery, and they also governed themselves, educated their children, practiced communal living, and engaged in self-reliance in the traditions of their West African ancestors. Currently, in the spirit of their resilient and industrious ancestors, the Clotilda descendants are actively engaged in various activities and events that are designed to preserve and revitalize AfricaTown, such as the Spirit of Our Ancestors Festival, the building of a new visitor center, the building of a museum, scuba diving education, the restoration of Mobile County Training School, and the implementation of the AfricaTown Connections Blue Way project that will connect residents and tourists to relevant riverine historic sites, including the Clotilda wreckage. So, the Clotilda Africans and their descendants are very excited about the future of AfricaTown, a community built by their resilient ancestors. And these are some of those descendants. These are by no means all of the descendants, because there are many, and I'm meeting new descendants all the time who are coming forward, particularly in light of the excavation of the Clotilda. This is actually Cudjoe. He was a member of the Clotilda Cargo. He was one of the leaders and governors of AfricaTown, along with Kupoloo, also known as Poli, and Gumpa, and Charlie, and so on and so forth. They were self-governing people. And this is an image of Cudjoe and his granddaughters, Martha and Mary. And what is so important about this picture is that Martha and Mary were twins. And in Cudjoe's family, among his descendants, 3, possibly 4 or more sets of twins were born. And what's interesting about that is that Cudjoe, being a Yoruba man, he hails from the Yoruba people who have one of the highest rates of twinning in the world. Lots of twins are born among Yoruba peoples in Nigeria. And these are some of his descendants: Altavis, Eric, Gary, and Robbie. This is Charlie. Charlie is said to be Cudjoe's brother. We've not been able to establish whether or not they were blood brothers, but quite often, when Africans arrived in the hold of the same slave ship, they considered themselves family members. So this is Charlie. He was a member of the Clotilda Cargo. And these are some of his descendants. There's Miss Lorna Woods and her daughter at the top right of that image. Miss Lorna Woods is quite the quilter. So there is a quilting tradition among individuals in AfricaTown as well. And she has some of her quilts on display at the Spirit of Our Ancestors Festival. In the bottom right are numerous, multiple generations of Charlie's descendants in AfricaTown. And at the left is me with Joycelyn Davis. Joycelyn Davis, who is the founder of the Clotilda Descendants Association. Joycelyn Davis is also very actively engaged, as is the other descendants, in preserving the history of AfricaTown. And this is myself and Dr. Deborah Plant. Dr. Plant is the editor of the book Barracoon. And I'm holding a plaque in my hand because I was the keynote speaker at the 2019 Spirit of Our Ancestors Festival, and Joycelyn Davis named that festival for my book by proclamation of the Clotilda Descendants Association. So I'm very grateful to Joycelyn and the Clotilda Descendants Association. So I had the honor of introducing the subsequent keynote speaker, Dr. Plant, who was the editor of the book Barracoon, that was authored really through the work by Zora Neale Hurston, who, as you may know, was an anthropologist who collected a lot of folklore and very rich ethnographic material from a lot of African Americans, including Cudjoe. Zora Neale Hurston was involved in the history and the research on AfricaTown very, very early on, and we owe a great debt to Zora Neale Hurston for the work that she has done on the Clotilda story, as well as other stories. This is Kupoloo, or Poli, known as Poli Allen more formally. He was a Clotilda African. And these are some of his descendants. This is Jeremy Ellis and Darren Patterson, who are also very actively engaged in the preservation of the history of AfricaTown. There's Miss Vernetta Henson. She is also a descendant of Polly Allen. This is an image of Gumpa. Gumpa is has a very interesting connection to the Clotilda Cargo. He was a member of the Cargo, but he didn't become a member of the Cargo because he was captured in a raid either in Oyo or in the Kaduna region. He becomes a member of the Cargo because he was given to Captain Foster as a gift. As some Africans were in the history of the slave trade, given to foreign slave traders, to Europeans and Americans, as gifts, as souvenirs, right? To commemorate, if you will, their coming to Africa for the purpose of slave trading. There is a street named for Gumpa. He was sometimes called African Peter or Peter Lee. And so there is a street named for him, and that chimney that I showed you earlier is the last remnant, if you will, of his house in AfricaTown. And this is one of his descendants, Delisha Marshall. I met her for the first time late last year. And it's so wonderful because now I've been involved in this case long enough to have interviewed some of the early descendants, maybe second, third generation. And so now I am able to meet and interview and interact with some sixth generation descendants of the Clotilda Africans, and it's a very special thing, very special. This is Ted Kibi. He is a descendant of the Clotilda African named Asi Kibi, and Ted Kibi is quite the historian and quite the musician in AfricaTown. And this is Michael Foster. Michael Foster is a descendant of Captain Foster. He is a first cousin 4 times removed, which is the way that he explained it. But it was a pleasure to meet him as well, because up to, I would say, 2019, I did not know that he existed. And it would be great to have his contribution to this story for the sake of balance, right? Such a pleasant person to interact with. On the left is Dr. James Delgado, whom I mentioned earlier, who is leading the excavation of the Clotilda. Because this is such an interesting case, and the Clotilda's voyage is such a unique one, when the Clotilda returned to Alabama, Captain Foster actually attempted to scuttle or burn the ship to hide the evidence of her illegal voyage. Well, he didn't completely succeed, and the Clotilda sank in the eastern branch or in the Mobile River I'm sure it's moved somewhat from the place where it was originally, but perhaps not far, in the Mobile River, such that we now know where its remnants are. And Dr. Delgado is leading the effort to excavate the wreckage of the Clotilda, along with a wonderful team of very smart, knowledgeable individuals, including Kamal Siddiqui, who is pictured in the middle, who is the lead instructor for Diving with a Purpose, and the former president of the National Association of Black Scuba Divers. So we can thankfully say that the excavation of the Clotilda is in competent hands under their leadership. There is a more recent article of mine. You can see that printed at the bottom of the slide. You have the book, but a more recent article was published by National Geographic History magazine, in case anyone is interested in learning more, not just about the story, but through this article, I zoom in a little further on the ship itself. So this is myself and Delisha, and there are some other descendants aboard the boat, and we are actually traveling up the Mobile River to the watery grave of the Clotilda. For me, that was my first time going to that site. And the Clotilda smuggling episode was a crime that victimized 110 West African captives. But the greater story is how those captives drew on their West African heritages to overcome their victimization. Therefore, rather than serving only as a trope of injustice within the context of the illegal slave trade, as an imperfection in the American democratic experiment, the Clotilda serves as a didactic vessel that embodies and communicates a more complex story regarding her captives' resiliency and self-made racial justice vis-a-vis their victimization. So, viewing the Clotilda's watery grave corroborates 30 years of transatlantic research on the Clotilda case. But rather than concluding my work, the excavation of the Clotilda opens up a new chapter, to the extent that the Clotilda story has its own momentum, as I have always argued several times. My work continues. Thank you very much. In some ways, I feel like I'm just beginning with this new chapter. I'm happy to remain relevant.
Yes, yes. Well, we are going to have time for a few questions. We will alternate questions with one from here in the room and one's online. So I will find the microphone. So do we have a question from anyone here in the room? I'll bring you the microphone. Okay, Frank, good.
Yes, I had a question on the pictures you were showing of the people from the Clotilda. When were those pictures took originally, do you know? Because I assume that they were maybe, 20 to 25 years old when they were captured. And if that was in like 1860, then
Right,
is it around the
so,
turn of the century maybe?
so we're talking about 20s, 1920s,
1920?
1930s.
Okay, so they were probably getting to be around 70 to 80 years old at that point?
Yes,
Okay.
indeed, indeed.
Okay, they did really well, then they lasted very strongly. And other question was, you said that one of the groups of people brought over on the Clotilda, 30 of them were took to that plantation, and then he just released them there.
They released them there because, they're hot property, if you will. They're
Yeah.
illegal property.
So basically, they paid the money for them and then brought them here and then got nothing out of what they spent.
Well, what they got out of what they spent was the ability to
Basically violate the law.
violate the law
Yeah.
and to escape being prosecuted for violating the law.
law,
Because they
okay.
actually hauled Captain Foster into court because he failed to pay customs duties.
Oh, okay.
They brought the ship in under the cloak of night, of course.
Yeah.
And as they did that, they, sailed past the custom house without paying the required
Okay.
duties.
Yeah. So, okay, thank you.
They knew the ship was coming in. There was some, indication that she had gone on a slaving venture. So to some extent, they were expecting her, and they launched a revenue cutter to search for it, but they didn't find the evidence because they hid the evidence. They hid the Clotilda Africans on a separate plantation at Mount Vernon. And then Captain Foster took the ship and set it afire. But they did haul Captain Foster into court for failing to pay customs duties. Timothy Mayer also went before the magistrate, but he created an alibi. And the judge accepted the alibi because my research suggests that he knew the judge personally. And the judge was also somebody who was empathetic to slavery and the slave trade. So it wouldn't have been hard to convince him to accept that alibi. And to the extent that Mayer was able to convince the judge to accept that alibi, he avoided prosecution, conviction, and death by hanging under the Piracy Act, and he won his bet.
Yes, so we have a number of questions. Two actually touch on similar topics, so I'll combine them for you. How would you respond to the common statement, Africans sold their own brothers and sisters into slavery, which was the primary cause of the trade? And then do you have any idea of the fate of these captives if they were not sold into slavery?
Well, let's take the second one first. I do not have, any information regarding their fate. Were they not sold into slavery? But my response to the first question is that the transatlantic slave trade was buyer-driven, not seller-driven. The Europeans created the slave trade by coming to the Americas, opening up the Americas for colonization, decimating Native American people, then calling on Africa to replace those decimated peoples with African laborers, because as the Europeans were setting up the colonies in the Americas, they needed labor to do that initially. Then after being here for a while, they discovered that the land was conducive to planting tobacco and sugar cane and rice and cotton, all of which demanded labor. So they began to call at African ports for that labor. So the transatlantic slave trade was buyer-driven, not seller-driven. Also, the Europeans remained heavily involved in the slave trade on that side of the Atlantic to the extent that they built slave castles on the West African coast, on down and around, to East Africa, so that they could transact slave sales right there in Africa. Those castles were not funded, if you will, by the Africans. They were funded by the Europeans. Also, the Dutch supplied guns to African peoples, instigated warfare among Africans, so that that warfare would produce more captives. So, sometimes people raise that question as a way of laying the blame for the slave trade squarely on the shoulders of the Africans, but we cannot allow that to happen because of the role of the Europeans in that initially, and then later the role of the Americans in it once the Americans began to build their own slave ships here. The first one being the Desire, built, I believe, in Rhode Island in 1638. So that once the Americans began to build their own slave ships here, they began to leave here, go straight to Africa, and bring Africans back here to the Americas. So what was a triangular slave trade, sort of like a 360, degree trade, became a 180-degree trade, where they left straight from here, went to Africa, and brought Africans back. Now, on the African side, we know, for example, in the case of the Fon warriors that I spoke about, the Fon warriors sold more than 2 million Africans into the slave trade. That is undeniable. So they were prolific slave traders. But not all Africans sold other Africans. This is what must be established, because by and large, Africans are peaceful peoples. But warriors such as the Fon peoples, the Oyo Yoruba, and others became involved in the slave trade because they were already set up as warriors in the first place, so they were already predisposed to engage in warfare. But when the slave trade comes into existence, it really gives them another way of distinguishing and selling off and disposing of their enemies. So the Fon peoples caught Yoruba peoples, who caught Fon peoples, and sold each other into the slave trade. So indeed, we have the evidence that some Africans sold other Africans, but not all Africans sold other Africans. And the Europeans are equally, if not more, culpable, and later the Americans, in the slave trade as buyers.
Weren't there a lot of Africans also sold to Brazil, or shipped over also as slaves?
Yes, all over the world, basically. But, especially where Europeans opened up, areas of the world for colonization. And we know that because if you go to Brazil, for example, you will find Yoruba culture there, even though Yoruba culture is indigenous to Nigeria, southwestern Nigeria in particular. You may find even pure, if you will, vestiges of Yoruba culture in Brazil, because many Yoruba captives were carried there, and wherever they went, they carried their religion. They carried their agricultural skills, their drumming skills. They carried their, weaving and carving and tanning skills with them. So you have a very, very strong presence of Yoruba culture in Brazil, especially in Bahia.
while I have the mic, tell us about the mayor who built the ship in Mobile, correct? Was he a shipbuilder, or what was his background?
Yes, he was engaged in shipbuilding. He's actually a transplant from Maine, Captain Foster from Pictou, Nova Scotia. And at that particular time, or I should say right about the 1830s or so, when many of the Native Americans had been decimated and cleared out of the Gulf region, that opened up the Gulf region, the Gulf states, for cotton planting, which then, increased a lot of interest in that area for cotton production. And the mayors were very, as was other people, very interested in capitalizing on that. In the case of the mayors, through shipbuilding, plantation owning, and steamboating, because we know that the mayors were heavily engaged in moving bales of cotton from the interior of Alabama, so Wetumpka, down to the Mobile docks. And so I suppose he had a vertical business model, right? Because he had several businesses going that were all connected to the slave trade on some level. But then again, any business that's operating before 1865 is connected directly or indirectly to the slave trade. Okay? I mean, lots of information has been coming out lately about various institutions being connected to slavery. There was a major slave trader in Rhode Island named James Brown, for example. He had a vertical business model. He was transporting a lot of captives. So most of your plantations in the South, that's where you have a lot of Africans being sort of contained for the purposes of cotton production and so on and so forth. But as you move into the New England states, you don't find like gang labor, gang slave labor. What you find more often than not, you do find slavery in the New England states on different levels. You find Africans working in the whaling industry and so on and so forth, right? But the New Englanders, many of them, let's say from Baltimore on up, were more interested in building the ships for the trade, okay? In addition to that, James Brown, for example, distilled rum for the trade. That was a very important trade item. And so he made so much money, ultimately, he decided to donate some of that money to Providence College. And that's how a lot of institutions get started, through endowments, if you will, from wealthy benefactors. And then Providence College, for its gratitude, in exchange for that endowment, changed the name of Providence College to Brown University. So Brown University was endowed in part with slave trader money. Old money makes new money. And we see those connections all over the place, actually. So that, companies that were shipbuilding, banks that were supplying loans for individuals who wanted to engage in the slave trade, who wanted to buy Africans. You could actually go to a bank and take out a mortgage on Africans. And those Africans become your property, just like your house or your horses or your cows, and so on and so forth. That being true, it means that the tax collector, when the tax collector comes around, he's going to levy taxes on your house, your horse, your buggy, and your Negroes. Then that tax revenue goes into the coffers of the municipality or the state, and so on and so forth. So cities, states, banks, insurance agencies made money from the slave trade. And almost any business that is in operation before 1865 is either directly connected or indirectly connected to the slave trade. That was the business of the day. I mean, not long ago, Wachovia, which is not around anymore, or perhaps around Wachovia become Wells Fargo. Wachovia had a disclaimer on its website apologizing for the role of its parent company in the slave trade. I was on the phone one day searching for car insurance, so I asked the agent, who's going to underwrite the policy? He said, Lloyd's of London. I said, Lloyd's of London? Are you kidding me? Lloyd's of London insured slave ships. And now they're insuring cars? He said, oh, yeah, how did you know that? I said, well, I'm an historian, and this is my specialty. But what it confirms for us again is the fact that old money makes new money.
We'll have one more question from the virtual audience, and we're putting my email up there for all the questions that we didn't get to answer. I'll be happy to get those to Dr. Robertson, and I'm sure she'll be happy to reply. But Kira, give us one last question.
Yes, we've had so many fantastic questions online. But I will combine two, and that way we will knock out a couple of them about the establishment of AfricaTown. Was it before or after emancipation? And then when and how did the Clotilda people hear or know about emancipation? And then did they decide to establish AfricaTown?
Well, it was after emancipation, and like several Africans who were enslaved, Africans and their descendants who were enslaved in the United States, some of that information is carried via the waterways. You know, it sort of spreads. And the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation actually occurred on Hampton University's campus under Emancipation Oak, which is on the National Register because it is so significant in the history of emancipation. And Hampton University also owns the pen that Lincoln used to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. So what happens is, you know, once that Emancipation Proclamation is read to those enslaved Black people, the news spreads very quickly, you know, and it can travel in a variety of ways, and one of the ways in which it travels is by way of, you know, the water, as boatmen are, you know, traveling from place to place. They carry that kind of information with them. I mean, you know, people traveling by horseback, people are riding each other too. I don't have any evidence that, of course, the Clotilda Africans received any writings about emancipation. But we do know that some of the Clotilda Africans were working in Mayor's lumber yard, and, you know, often that involves carrying goods back and forth to the boats and so on and so forth. And so that's how information would have and could have traveled.
Dr. Robertson. That was wonderful. I know we have many more questions that we will get to you to answer. Thank you all for coming tonight. We hope to see you at Sips and Trips on June 18th, where you can go through the galleries, touch and feel objects, drink wine, and eat food, and mingle. So we want you to come on June 18th to join us for Sips and Trips.
Well, thank you very much, Julie. Thank you to the Mariners Museum again for hosting this event. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedules to come and share this information with us. Thank you to those of you who are here, and thank you to those of you who have attended this lecture remotely. Thank you very much.
And we'll have a book signing here in the lobby if you're interested.